For those who don't know me, my name's Janet Lash, and I'm Nicholas Lash's widow. And I want to give you a very, very warm welcome to Fisher House on behalf of myself and our son Dominic, who's down there, and of course Father Paul. I want to welcome you particularly if this is the first time you've ever been in Fisher House. And it may be that you've lived in Cambridge for decades and you've never been in here. So this is where we are. Fisher House featured very much in my and Nicholas's life over the years. And it's a particular pleasure that we are here for this occasion because of those connections. My first memory is when Nicholas and I were married here in 1976. As some of you will know, he'd just been laicized and he felt that it was perhaps indelicate to ask whether we could be marrying in St Edmunds. And so Father Richard Ingleton, who was chaplain at the time, said, "Please come to Fisher House." And we had a great chamber available. Now, as some of you with long memories will also remember, Richard had a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel called Phil. And Phil, like all the Spaniels, was very, very greedy. So there was food upstairs in the great chamber, and he couldn't be left alone. So he spent the Mass under the credence table. I told a Jesuit about that at one point, and he squawked. It was here also in 2020, in this very room, this very chapel, that Nicholas' funeral took place. That was during the lockdown of COVID, and so the numbers had to be limited. So we had a limited number for our wedding because he'd just been there, so a limited number for his funeral. And it's nice to see a few more than limited here today. It's poignant being here and talking about him, of course, but it's also very happy. And it's very nice that Father Aubrey is with us, who was, because the then chaplain, Father Mark, was very ill and dying, Aubrey officiated at Nicholas's funeral, as he's done lots of other things actually. Now, I suppose in the nature of things, it's family and friends, and if we're lucky, colleagues who make us what we are. Nicholas was richly blessed with all three. He was born 90 years ago this year, and after a very peripatetic youth, came to Cambridge in 1968. Yes, 1968, because he had to come to Cambridge, wasn't he? At the age of 34, to work on a doctorate on John Henry Newman. Cambridge suited him very well, and he never left. Well, he went away for sabbaticals and things, but he was here for the whole of his career. His two great loves, I think, were the Catholic Church and Cambridge, although he was not unaware of the faults of either. St Edmunds, Clare Hall, Blackfriars, the Divinity Faculty, and since being involved in its foundation in 1993, the Margaret Beaufort Institute, were all part of his journey in the church and the academy, and he loved them all. He loved the Catholic Church, but his theology was never sectarian. He considered the ecumenical context of the Divinity Faculty as one of the great blessings of his life. November, as we all know, is about remembering. This November, it's 46 years since he was elected to the Norris House chair in succession to the great and wonderfully eccentric Donald McKinnon, of whom some of you may remember he did a great imitation. And it's a particular, I haven't seen her, but I think she's here, particular joy that his successor but two, Professor Catherine Pickstock, is here with us this evening. She is, there she is. proud to have become, when he was elected as Norris South, become the first Catholic professor of theology in Cambridge since the Reformation. And there's glory for you. Fortunately, we were both glad that he wasn't called to martyrdom as our patron, John Bishop. It might happen, so not for him. As someone who was a young adult in his early 60s, Nicholas was profoundly influenced by the experience of the Second Vatican Council. The image of the Church as a pilgrim people resonated particularly. Journeying with Others is in the title of lots of his books. I was looking on the shelf the other day. Theology on the Way to Emmaus. Theology for Pilgrims, Theology on Dover Beach. He didn't live to hear the Pope's announcement of the Synod on Solidarity, but I'm absolutely sure that he would have followed it with great interest had he lived to hear it. And that brings me to the point of all of this, today's lecture. And Professor Janet Soskis and Dr. John McDade sitting in the front. And I thought, here we have Janet and John. Janet is the president at the moment of the University Catholic Association, and she's going to introduce John and field comments and questions at the end if necessary. But before I hand it over to her, bear with me just for an anecdote. Those of you who knew Nicholas knew he loved anecdotes. I can't do it as well as he would. When we were married, the officiant at our wedding was Father John. Father John, who wasn't your wedding John, was Dr. Andy McDonough, who a great Irish theologian who taught most of the Irish bishops and priests during the period of his time at Maynooth. As things got underway, he introduced himself. My father was a little uncertain about his daughter marrying this theologian in Cambridge and all this stuff, but he visibly relaxed when Enda said, "I'm not sure really why I'm here, except that I'm another alcoholic theologian." Now, far be it for me to suggest that John is another alcoholic theologian, but I have to say that over the years, he and Nicholas, like Enda and Nicholas, were engaged in deep theological discussion over a glass of single malt. In John's case, Scotch. In Enda's case, of course, Irish. So I don't know whether whiskey is available in heaven or not, but I like to fantasize and think of Nicholas engaged in happy discussion with anybody who wants to talk to her with a glass of wine. And now I'll ask Janet to introduce John. If I can get down here without falling down.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to see so many of you. I was meant to say a few words about Nicholas in the Faculty of Divinity, where he was, as Janet said, for 21 years, the Norris House professor and the first Catholic professor of theology at Cambridge since the Reformation. I was lucky enough to overlap with him for 14 years there, and Nicholas was characterized by his rigor and his imagination and his elegant prose, and he played a large part in making Cambridge one of the most dynamic theological faculties, I want to say, in the English-speaking world, possibly the world. Why not be grand about it? Anyway, this is partly because he listened to so many other speakers, to Jewish studies, Eastern religions, close links between philosophy and theology. And at Cambridge, and it was a great deal to do with Nicholas, we taught theology grounded in the classics, Augustine, Aquinas, Barth, Schleiermacher, but listening to the margins. I remember one exam question he wanted to set, I don't know whether it made it through the committee, was, can good theology be badly written? Nicholas's answer to this would have been, no, it cannot, and he lived that. He was really interested in God, and he was really interested in theology, not just as words about God, but as a living force. And I was looking at Holiness, Speech and Silence, one of his many books, the section where he bemoans the fact that educated people would be appalled to think they were ill-educated about music or art or even automobiles, are very proud and not the least embarrassed by their ignorance of theology, even when they're churchgoers, he said. But he said that churches are not without blame, and he spoke of the failure of the Christian churches to understand themselves as schools of Christian wisdom, as richly endowed projects of lifelong learning. That is what he strove for. That is what he worked for with Jan, both of them so involved, and with the Margaret Rowan Institute as well. And that is, I hope, what we find at this place, Fisher House. So it's my great pleasure to introduce John McDaid, a very distinguished doctrinal and historical theologian, Catholic, taught for many, many years at the University of London, where he was principal of Heathrow College, and a long-standing member of the Catholic Theological Association, very old friend of Nicholas Lash's, and I'm sure this topic, Nicholas Lash and synodality, will be one that we'll be glad to hear about. Thank you.
Microphones are always very tricky things. If you know the story of the priest, in the days before the new English liturgy came into the Catholic Church, the priest tapped the microphone and said, "There's something wrong with this microphone." And the congregation said, "And also with you." Always true, always true. And it's a real pleasure to give this lecture in memory of Nicholas and to address the question of what his writings could contribute to the project of synodality, which is high on the agenda of the Catholic Church at the moment. It's perhaps the most focused attempt to bring Vatican II to bear on the internal life of the Church in order to conduct a more effective mission. So I want to consider how some of Nicholas's ideas might cast some light on the elusive ideals of synodality. Synodality is about finding or creating a core of ecclesial identity better than what we have at the moment. To use an image, a rising tide lifts all boats, and synodality might be that rising tide. There is something remarkable in Nicholas's work, an uncorked passion for knowledge and experience, an intellectual exuberance that is often and still breathtaking. In fact, one finds that one takes a lot of breaths reading Nicholas. A minor character in the 17th century, the Duchess of Orleans, said, "It is so rare for an intellectual to dress properly, not to smell, and to understand jokes." She could, of course, have been speaking about Nicholas. Jan, he was always very clean, thanks to you, I suspect, and he loved jokes. But of course, his merits were far more than that. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, in his work Journey to Armenia, asks, "What tense do you want to live in?" He answers, "I want to live in the imperative of the future passive participle in the what ought to be." Now, I can see that not many of you have had the benefits of a Scottish grammarian education. I know the story of St. Peter looking after the gates And he hears a figure approaching the gates, and he says, "Who goes there?" And the voice comes back, "It is I." And Peter says, "Oh no, not another Scottish teacher of grammar." Mandelstam's wife Nazeczka said of her husband, "It is not so simple to go against everybody and against the times." And I suspect that Jan might have felt the same thing about Nicholas. It takes a lot of steel to search throughout a lifetime for what ought to be. For one thing, how do you know what it is? Did Mandelstam, writing as a poet, know what it was? Did Nicholas, writing as a theologian? Do we? I think that Nicholas took this imperative seriously. He was a hard-thinking man. Get this pronunciation right. A hard-thinking man. Partly, I suspect, because he knew that religious people often don't do hard thinking. And someone had to do it, and we're better than Cambridge. He had that rare thing, a holy mind. Let me read you a passage about an academic, not Nicholas. And this is number 1 on the sheets, if you'd like to turn to that. You'll see that there's no attribution here, because I wondered if you know where this is from. "For my part, I am very sorry for him. It is an uneasy lot at best to be what we call highly taught and yet not to enjoy. To be present at this great spectacle of life and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self. Never to be fully possessed by the glory we behold, never to have our consciousness rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardour of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and uninspired, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted." Any suggestions where this is from? Right? No?
George Eliot.
George Eliot, writing about Castlebar. Now this judgment clearly could not be applied to Nicholas, and it certainly could not be applied to Eamon Duffy, who is the exact opposite of this description. But it is George Eliot's judgment on the Reverend Edward Castlebar in Middlemarch, who's writing the key to all mythologies. Too often theology has been taught by highly taught Castlebars in order to breed the next generation of Castlebars who don't enjoy their lives any more than their teachers did. There's a study to be done on self-replication among theologians, and I'm sure this never happens in Cambridge. But good theology has a bearing upon what is life-giving, religiously and humanly. And one of the things that Nicholas insisted on is that you cannot separate what is religiously meaningful from what is humanly meaningful. For Nicholas, God is active always and everywhere. And one of the interesting things in his writings, he insists that you don't have to have a religious experience of God to be in touch with God. Everyone has an experience of God. Let me tell you a little cameo. 2 fish swimming in the water, young fish. And an old fish passes them by and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And he carries on. And one fish says to the other, "What the hell is water?" I think that's Rana and Nicholas on how we are all in God. But it's not an object of thought, it is where we are that makes us who we are. So, for Nicholas, Christian life is simply human life, as he put it, lived to its maximum intensity. If your religion isn't humanly meaningful, then it needs to change, or it will wither, and we will wither. A religion and theology that keeps us at the level of a small, hungry, shivering self will eventually be cast off by people in favour of an identity outside the church. And Nicholas writes that a religion that is simply inherited or inhabited, interesting word, or that is a mere matter for intellectual consideration. He says that these are religion by proxy. And if my religion is by proxy, then I'm not there. And I can't find my identity there, and that's what many people feel and find. They cannot feel about themselves the way they think the church makes them feel or wants them to feel, and they drift off. But the church, in its present condition, does seem to be remarkably, if unintentionally, successful in breeding post-Christians who emerge from a proxy religion. And even if we put our minds to producing these people, I doubt that we would be more successful than we are at the moment. Now, I think Nicholas despised the small, hungry, shivering self created by a certain style of Catholic identity. And I think Pope Francis shares this feeling, and this is what synodality might address, if it's effective. It is meant to challenge by offering a different model of how individuals relate to one another within the body of Christ, the kind of growth of mind and heart better than what we have at the moment. And I want to approach the question by doing two things. First of all, with quotation 2 on your sheets, referring you to a remark from the great Dominican theologian Yves Congar, writing in 1947. The church is, at one and the same time, a hierarchical society and a living body, institution and community, made from above and constantly being made from below. The conjunction of these two elements, I think, is so interesting. Our trouble is that the church as a hierarchical society too often takes precedence over the church as a living body constantly being made from below. Pope, bishops, priests and deacons are highly visible, juridical, liturgical and pastoral presences, forming the structure of the institution that the church is. Synodality, I suggest, is a way at this time by which the church might be made from below. And that's what makes it tricky in many ways. I'll pick this up later when I refer to Nicholas and the two English writers he draws upon, Cardinal Newman and Baron von Hugel. Now, the second thing I will do at this stage is to outline the meaning of a term that the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has made his own. Synodality, I think, qualifies as a social imaginary. And Taylor uses this term to describe the set of accepted features of a social organization, the values and aims that are implicitly accepted and lived by. Quotation 3 on your sheets. Taylor says this: there are important differences between social imaginary and social theory. I speak of imaginary because I'm talking about the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms. It is carried in images, stories, and legends. But it is also the case that theory is usually the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society. Which leads to a third difference. The social imaginary is that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. So I think synodality offers a different social imaginary to the church, altering the self-image and the practice of the church at this point in its mission. The social imaginary of a monarchical church governed by an ecclesiastical emperor, may have made sense in 1302 when Pope Boniface VIII declared that subjection to the Roman pontiff was necessary for salvation. But that's not normative for all ages, some of you might be glad to hear. There is more to the church than hierarchy. We know that. But if that is so, what difference should that more make? Nicholas tried to answer that, and so does the project of synodality. Now, is the present social imaginary of the church, as it is perceived both inside and outside the church, something that alienates not only those outside the church, but also those inside the church? Now, that question should stimulate reflection about what ought to be. I've suggested that the hierarchical nature of the church, its institutional character, and characteristically Roman liking for order, is counterbalanced by a process whereby the church is constantly being made from below. I remember Cardinal Thomas Winning of Glasgow, a very strange, powerful ecclesiastical presence, telling a men's sodality. This is the kind of thing that cardinals did in those days. They went to men's sodality to instruct them on various things. And Cardinal Winning said to this men's sodality, "We are all equal before we begin to be different." We are all equal before we begin to be different. Now, such an interesting phrase. Is equality then left behind once the sacrament of order comes into view? Or does it persist? Inequality is built into the church as a hierarchical society, whether that pleases us or not. But equality, the mutuality of the baptized with one another, actively engaged in questions that concern the church, is a feature of how the church might be constantly made from below. So, what is synodality not about? Can we clear the decks a little? For one thing, it's not about committees deciding things, nor is it about pressure groups giving pressure groups their head, or sorting out debates between liberals and conservatives. Press coverage of synodal discussions in Rome too often give that impression. I think that any form of factionalism is against the Catholic thing, but I'm old-fashioned in this matter. Nicholas was very insistent throughout his life, and I quote, that Catholic ecclesiology is that the church is governed by its bishops. And he felt it wasn't being properly governed because the bishops were afraid of having their knuckles rapped by the Roman Curia. It's a point that Cardinal Hume spoke about many times, the way in which he was humiliated by soutanned Roman bureaucrats. Nicholas also said many times, like an ecclesial mantra, I wish I could do his accent, "It is not the job of the Pope to run the church." Well, I think that the great majority of Catholics think that this is exactly what the Pope should do, run the church. The benefit of studying church history, as Eamon Duffy frequently points out, is that it stops you thinking that the way things are at the moment is the way they always have been, and the way they necessarily must be if the church is to be the church of God. We might joke that the definition of a bishop's mitre is that it is an artificial space above a real vacuum. And certainly one should never tell that joke in public. But the flourishing of the church requires an attentiveness to other aspects. Like Nicholas and von Hugo, Nicholas accorded the hierarchy of the church the responsibility for governing, but he didn't want to restrict the office of teaching to the bishops and pope. Like Newman, he thought that bishops authorize teaching, but they don't have an exclusive claim on teaching or how the gospel is lived. Karl Rahner used to mock the idea that bishops were teachers. Where did they learn their theology, he used to ask. From theologians, he would answer. Like Newman and von Hugel, Nicholas thought that the church has become preoccupied with a strangely monological form of teaching in which those who teach and instruct belong to the circle of apostolic office. And von Hugel, writing in 1909, says this in its quotation 4 on your sheets. There is a grave difficulty as to the working out of the Catholic idea of authority. The centralizing, the absolutizing of authority has now got to a pitch tending to destroy authority's own raison d'etre, and to paralyze instead of stimulating the powers of the soul. Paralysis of the powers of the soul. What a strong and troubling phrase that is. But where authority becomes too powerful in its hold, the soul begins to shrivel. That's what Hugel was getting at. In a paper to the English Bishops' Theology Committee in the late 1980s, Nicholas pointed out, and this is number 5 on your sheets, sorry, a catechetical concentration on experience, when insufficiently attentive to scripture and tradition and unconcerned with Catholicity or universality, becomes sectarian and self-indulgent. At the same time, a theological preoccupation with academic rigor, without a pastoral responsibility to the needs of particular people and to the wider tradition, becomes mere theory. And finally, episcopal government, without regard for truth and real spiritual needs, becomes at best mere management, and probably bad management at that. Still valid points, I would judge. Each aspect, when detached from the rest, creates bad things like sectarianism, mere theory and useless knowledge, and bad management. That litany of what can go wrong is a bit like the triad of things one used to be warned about, possibly in the Catechism: loose living, bad company, and the neglect of prayer, which people used to say was a perfect description of Jesuit life. But if they are connected to one another, then feeling, thought, and institution are force fields that need one another if the church is to function properly. Dissolve the triad, dissolve the tension and the interaction, and you impair what the church ought to be. The right phrase again. You'll see that Nicholas's strategy here, as in so many other things, is to insist that things function only when they're related to other aspects with which they stand in tension. A true church will be a tensional church. Isolate one aspect and you will go wrong. Handle them in an integrating way while acknowledging that there are necessary tensions, and you might get it right. And as I suggested earlier, do we really know what the matrix might be with greater clarity than Mandelstam knew what his poetry should be? There is no fixed template available to us, largely because it's how we construct it. Now let me explain. Nicholas's inspiration for his ideas about the church come from Newman and von Hugel, and he adopts von Hugel's characterization of the 3 elements of religion: the institutional, the intellectual, and the mystical. And he develops this as a way of saying what the Christian religion ought to be in its mature form. For von Hugel and Nicholas, a child's religion is a fact and a thing, based on sense and memory. in which we believe what we're told because we trust those who open it up for us. Nicholas, following von Hugel, speaks of the child's world of external, unintellectualized fact. And you would be right to suspect that Nicholas bridled at the idea of a fact that was unintellectualized. At this first stage, the Christian religion is felt to be, and I quote, authoritative, historical, traditional, and institutional. Sound familiar? Well, ask anyone who's had a Catholic upbringing. The child sees no reason to go beyond how that religion presents itself institutionally and ritually. But remain at this stage as an adult, suggests Nicholas, and you harvest a fundamentalism and a traditionalism which he characterizes as infantilist, and that can block the church from finding the adult authenticity it needs. Infantilist, an interesting phrase with serious overtones. Nicholas thinks that if one is locked into this phase, and he thinks that people can be locked into this, there is an absolutizing of particular facts, events, places, authorities, images, narratives, texts, or formulas. And this contracts and shrivels a person's religion, making it, as he puts it, as something simply alongside of other things in life. The tendency, as Nicholas sees it, is damaging and leads towards, this took my breath away when I read it, it leads towards superstition and idolatry. Your religion can be idolatrous. I'm not going to pursue that, but that's one of the things that I think drives Nicholas's concern, to find a way beyond what is misleading and what doesn't give life. Now, that's the first phase. The second phase, if you like, the intellectual, then comes into play. And that's the work of argumentation, questioning, reasoning, and independent inquiry. And this cannot be banished from the Christian religion. The religion absorbed by the senses and the claims of authority are now scrutinized. Ask any teenager, Catholic or not. If the institutional aspect can give rise to superstition and idolatry, then the intellectual aspect, Nicholas thought, can issue in rationalism and indifference. And God knows there's a lot of that around. Nicholas thought that intellectualism or rationalism was the hallmark of a religious culture stuck in an unsatisfactorily resolved crisis of adolescence. The model, as you can guess, is that of human growth or maturity. Nicholas wanted a Christianity for adults, but diagnosed a Christianity stuck in immaturity. So this second element of questioning and reflective judgment is where fresh insight and evaluation can come to the fore. And this subverts, or at least challenges, the religion of habit and naive acceptance. By the way, this scheme which Nicholas adopts from von Hugel, once understood, ought to free Christians from crudely importing culture wars into the church and envisaging a battle between institutional inheritance and intellectual critique within the church that must issue in the defeat of one and the victory of another. And if Nicholas is right, both of these aspects remain. It's not a question of one disposing of the other. Both have their place within the matrix of Christian life. I've long suspected that people slide out of the Christian community not because of what they hold about God and Jesus, but because they don't want to feel about themselves the way they think that the church makes them feel. The issue is not theology. but anthropology, an account of the human, that just doesn't make sense. In many ways, we have a religious rhetoric suited to an earlier age that is miles away from the way in which people experience themselves and their life world. We are not regarded by our contemporaries as, and this is a wonderful modern word, relatable. People don't think they can relate to us in any serious way. Peter Hackett was a Jesuit headmaster, and he would always have hesitated to call himself a theologian. We were sitting, as Jesuits do, occasionally drinking some whiskey, and he reached for the bottle of whiskey and he said to me, "John," in a very pompous voice, "John, Christianity lacks an anthropology of its own. It has to learn from other sources what it means to be human." I took my breath away. I still remember this moment. It was one of the few theological things that Peter Hackett ever said, but I was struck by how right it might be. A good starting point might be the European Values Survey that showed that young people hold the following in high regard. It's a little list, quite interesting to listen to. Human rights, tolerance, respect for the convictions of others, liberty, friendship, love, solidarity, fraternity, justice, respect for nature, humanitarian intervention. By God, what a list. And a life lived according to these values is credible and possible and attractive. It is relatable, appealing to the best instincts in us. And these values are felt to be normative, fulfilling, and of higher authenticity than the practice of a religion. We've been out-narrated by a more attractive secular agenda, and some refurbishment of a relatable Christian anthropology is surely on the agenda. But if the emergence of the intellectual dimension focuses on the credibility or incredibility of Christian faith, it's also how the Church is able to review its life and mission. After all, we're living through the de-Christianization of Europe, and it's a really interesting time. If this is so, you would expect the Church in this country to want to address this seriously, theologically, sociologically, and pastorally, so that the best decisions can be made. I don't see any evidence that this is taking place. Consultation, listening, and dialogue are needed in serious conversations that should take place between bishops and people, but those conversations have not been happening. For example, does it matter to bishops that many sensible and mature people think that the template of parish life, composed of a declining number of unmarried priests, supplemented by married deacons, makes no sense as a pastoral strategy for the local church? What is the case in favour of this strategy? And on what basis should it be preferred to others? We haven't been told. That bishops make decisions without, as Newman might have put it, consulting the laity on matters of administration seems, to put it lightly, rather odd, and appears distrustful of involving laity at too high a level. But the good news is that the final document of the recent Roman Synod intends to remedy this. You know of the Irish parish priest. It's always good to have a story about an Irish parish priest who used to say, "I'm against all change, especially change for the better." That works out. But let's recognize that the old way of things exercises a pull because of its manifest strength, its muted dependability, what we might call the vision and memory of a stable Christendom, a secure familial hearth that makes us feel at home in the world. This can exist alongside a gnawing sense, becoming widespread among Catholics, I think, even if it's not always articulated, that perhaps everything has been wrong underneath. The American novelist Flannery O'Connor remarks, "I hope that to be of two minds about some things is not to be neutral. There can be a difficult two-mindedness that is absolutely right and characteristically human and Christian. And I think that in this second phase, in the challenge it offers to inherited religion, honours two-mindedness. Not obviously a bad thing, as Flannery O'Connor recognises. There can be a wish to preserve the old way of things, perhaps the religion of the first phase that was able to convey a powerful sense of the felt presence of God. At the same time as there is a growing suspicion that everything is wrong underneath." Read Claire Keegan's novel of Irish life, Small Things Like These, and you'll have a powerful, subtle presentation of the tension within an ordinary Catholic family in an ordinary Irish town where this suspicion becomes explicit. I'm struck by something that Diarmaid Martin, the former Archbishop of Dublin, said. "A Catholicism of self-defined certainties will lead eventually to a doubt about all certainties, and thus to emptiness." Look at that sentence again. God, great for a bishop saying this. A Catholicism of self-defined certainties will lead eventually to a doubt about all certainties and thus to emptiness. A Catholicism of self-defined certainties and self-importance led to an authoritarian and harsh Irish Catholicism with consequences we know only too well. And this second phase is when a searchlight is directed at Christianity itself, its claims, its impact, its power over people's souls, its temptations to theocracy, its apparently strong reluctance to allow people to be free. After all, you can hold that while the Christian faith is true, it's surely clear that certain forms of Christian faith, perhaps the religion we were brought up in, are simply not good for people. I suspect that Pope Francis knows this too well, and that part of his push towards synodality is a wish to address this issue. Unlike his two predecessors, Francis is not a culture warrior, nostalgic for the Christendom he grew up in. The French philosopher Alain Badiou, in the middle of an essay, not to do with religion at all, in the middle of an essay, makes an offhand remark that Christianity is only interested in its own survival. Yes, Alain, and not just survival. It's also had an eye for social and political power, and for controlling people by getting inside their heads. And the psychological power of a church over people is being resisted and expelled. People no longer want a dubious social institution to control them. The church is becoming incredible for many people. Franz Kafka, the great Czech novelist, said, "Religions get lost as people do." And I think that each religion has its own way of getting lost. I think I've got some idea about how Christianity has got lost, can still get lost. It's for Jews and Muslims and other people to reflect on their own thing. But it's important for Christians to ask, what is the way in which Christianity might get lost, or might have got lost, become frozen in forms that no longer give life to us or those around us? And we need to acknowledge the phenomenon of internal exile, of Catholics alienated by the way the Church is at the moment, caused partly by a feeling that they have no say and are given no real chance to contribute how things are run and how they are to develop. Is there anywhere contained in the Gospel the work and mission of Jesus Christ that women should have no acknowledged invisible role in the body of the Church? And if we are not mature in our self-criticism and self-evaluation, and I see this as integral to this second phase.
Your mic's gone, so you might have to really...
There is no problem with the mic.
No problem. Okay, it's just...
The problem is with the other part of the gadget. It's being repaired.
Okay.
I'll take a break after the next few sentences. If we're not mature in our self-criticism, self-evaluation, in identifying ways in which we might have got lost, why should anyone take it seriously? This aspect of a renewed church that has accepted what Margaret Farley calls the grace of self-doubt should be part of a process of sincerity. But at this point, you've had enough theology, you should talk for a few minutes to relieve the boredom of all of this, and then we'll pick up the next question.